Welcome to the show. I'm so excited to be filming episode 2 of the NeuroMarvels. I'm Dr. Gwen Palafox, and I'm a neurotypical psychologist who really just does her best every day. Dana?
I'm Dr. Dana Waters. I'm a neurodivergent psychologist, and you do a great job trying to align and understand. Yeah.
Thanks, Dana. So we are on episode 2, and Dana and I are just having too much fun. So we're just going to keep this train a rolling.
Yep.
So today, Dana and I really wanted to bring up the topic of sensory processing and sensory profiles. This is something that we run into quite a bit, actually. So Dana, why don't you get us started on just sensory processing in general, maybe as a general idea or what it is.
Yeah. So I teach about this as well, where I teach, and most people are familiar with the 5 senses that we talk about. That people are, let me back up. So when people say I have a 6th sense, it's outside of, it's meant to be like ESP. It's outside of the ones that we know and talk about every day, which are vision, hearing, taste, and I have / texture, because texture goes along with that, becomes really important in autistic folks. Smell and touch. So those are like the big 5 that we talk about mostly. And then there's other ones, though. We'll talk a little bit today about proprioception and something called interoception. And those can be 6 and 7, and you can sort of keep going in terms of splitting hairs and some of those. So we think about sensory things have 2 components to them. So the first thing is the sense organ. So like our eyes are our sense organ for vision, and smell, our nose and some of our mouth is our sense organ for smelling and tasting, that kind of thing. Or touch, our skin. There's some little funny little receptors in our skin. One of my favorite words of all time is Pansinian corpuscles that feel pressure and things like that. And then, so we've got all these things that take in information from our environment, and those are like our sense organs. That travels to our brain, and then we make sense of that input, and that is what we would talk about as perception. So we've got 2 pieces of it. We've got the sensation pieces, and then we've got perception. We know in autistics that it's a combination of both of those things that can contribute to sensory overload, or some folks have senses that they're not that cued into. Proprioception being one example, and I'll get into, and interoception, we can talk about that more when we get to that. But everybody has all those basic 7 or 8 senses, and then our brain processes it, right? So an eye can't see on its own. It's really how our brain makes sense of it. And so those of our viewers that have, and you have had a child, have very little babies, right when they're born, they're kind of looking around and not looking at much. As we develop, all those senses get tuned in through experience and our genetics and some other kinds of things as we go along. And are continually changing. What's really interesting about senses in autistic folks is we have evidence now neurologically that autistic folks are born with more neural connections than neurotypical babies are. And there's this thing that happens in the 3rd trimester, maybe about 3 weeks before a baby's born. We have brain cells that are called neurons, and then we have connections between them. And we know in neurotypical babies, those neural connections start to prune back or get cut off about 3 weeks before birth. With autistic babies, though, that process doesn't happen. So in a way, autistic babies are born into the world like feeling more in terms of these senses, right? So you think about typical Western births, they're in a hospital, it's cold, it's noisy, it's really bright lights, those kinds of things. So autistic babies come into the world sort of hyper-wired, if you will, in terms of senses. And then as we develop, that does change a bit, but some of the theory is because we come in out of the chute, if you will, somewhat hyper-wired, it's sort of a setup a little bit for that overwhelm. And if you think about that coupled with being a baby, you can't talk yet, even being a little kid, you can't necessarily put words to things. It sort of explains a little bit why very young children have a harder time with sensory kinds of things than adults do, who have figured out some coping mechanisms by then. And maybe their brain has actually figured out a way to wire and move them through the world that's a little easier to navigate, right? And then these senses, these perceptions vary wildly from person to person, neurotypical or not, right? And those can have fluctuations. Women will report when they're pregnant, a lot of this kind of stuff changes. My mom would talk about even the smell of bacon would make her totally sick when she was pregnant, and she normally loved bacon. So there's all kinds of things that can contribute to the stress and hormones and different times of the month for women, and seasonal sort of variations for men. There's all kinds of things that can affect this. And I always tell folks that they're asking about sensory issues. In the neurodiverse paradigm, the sort of umbrella over ADD, ADHD, autism, and some other things, sensory issues are always there in autism. So that's one of the things that sort of is a cornerstone of that. Not everybody that has sensory issues is autistic, but every autistic person has some sort of sensory issues, even if they sort of come and go. So that's sort of the main lowdown of those things. Vision, people are familiar with. Hearing, taste, texture may be one that people, autistic folks will certainly understand. And we see this a lot in little kids who have food aversions, right? It's almost always texture. Sometimes it can be temperature of the food, or if it's spicy or things like that, but it's almost always texture, and some aversion is like a negative reaction to something. And so the little kids will only eat certain foods. And my mom swears that all I ate for one solid year was like hot dogs. And now I don't like hot dogs, but very limited sort of diet. And that texture is something I see with food that really does tend to pervade with adults as well. Some people are really, I can't eat that, it's too creepy.
Yep.
Smell is one that I have. We went to a baseball game the other day, and in this particular stadium, they have these things called garlic fries. And it makes the air have this really sort of weird, slightly putrid smell. And the whole time we were at the game, when I would get a waft of it, I would get this feeling of like, kind of nauseated.
Yeah.
Even though I knew what it was and try to talk myself out of it, those kinds of things. And then touch, a lot of people are really aware of. A lot of autistics don't like to be touched by other people, or certain touch things will bother them. The classic tags in the shirts, right, for autistic kids. I cut every tag out of every shirt I have, just because it rubs on there, kind of bothers me. The debate about fabric, right? Some people really like wool, and that's the only thing they'll wear. And other people are like, oh, I can't wear wool, I only want to wear cotton. And it's so idiopathic from person to person. The ones that people aren't as familiar with is this one called proprioception and this one called interoception. Proprioception is sort of like, where am I in space? Where is my body in relation to various things, right? And autistics typically are a little bit impoverished in this. Like I've lost count. If I had $1 for every time I ran into a door jam when I'm walking through the door, kind of not aware of where I am in space. And then interoception really is like our internal awareness, like that. Like, is my stomach full? Am I hungry? Are my eyes dry? Should I be thirsty? To really sort of freaky things. Like I have redundant nerves in all of my facial nerves in my teeth. So it's really hard for like dentists to numb me. Whether that's part of autism, who knows? But I can feel my intestines moving when they're moving and that kind of thing. And then other people, so that's sort of hyper aware. Other autistics can have hypo awareness. So they'll work all day and forget to eat, for example, because they're not tuned into cues of hunger. Little kids won't get woken up in the middle of the night to use the restroom, let's say. And so bedwetting can be really common and younger. I think I bet on and off, not as frequently, but until I was 12. And now I know that's pretty normal for an autistic kid. So all these sorts of things can be hypo, like low, or hyper, And some people have like lifelong pervasive things. Like I've known people that bright lights always bother them. Doesn't matter their stress level or not. And then folks maybe that bright lights would bother them if they were already high on some of these other input variables, if you will. And so it's so situational, but all of us have some sort of sensory sensitivity is the word you hear, right?
Yeah.
And it's probably because those neural pathways have more connections than neurotypical folks do. And there has been some palliative evidence for that. And or the perception part of our brain hooks into these things more, and more areas of our brain light up, especially if something's sort of irritating to us. So maybe we do learn over time to try to shut those out as a way to cope with that. So you'll see teenagers, young adults will say, I'm not aware of those feeling things. And then when you start to get them in touch with them and paying attention to it, you can go through a period of like hyper awareness where it's really annoying because being numb is easier.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I work a lot with autistic clients to deal with these and how can you manage them in the environment and so on.
Yeah. And Dana, there's one other sense that runs that I bump into a lot is the vestibular.
Yeah, I had that with hearing, but yeah.
Oh yeah. But that
that
idea of like, we can expand vestibular, we can expand hearing then, which is just that idea of the perception of spinning or height, or like how high you are off of something.
Yeah.
And I know that's like a visual thing.
Like you're tilting.
But or that you're like kind of vertigo, like kind of ideas,
Yes.
And that's something too, because like there are a lot of clients that I've supported that like to spin because they're hypo-regulated. They're under-regulated there. And so they like to have those sensations, or they don't get affected on roller coasters or things like that as much. Like they kind of seek those types of things. I think it's so important that we're talking about the senses, sensations, registration, perception, because I feel like it's the first way in which a person encodes the environment that they're in.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And which inevitably impacts the way that they look behaviorally, right? As a neurotypical person, if I didn't have the understanding of sensations, sensitivities, I might misperceive someone's behavior as being non-compliant, weird, odd, just a bad parenting.
Yeah.
I mean, because you think
always
about
blame
food,
the parents,
right? But you think about like food, right? And you were talking about texture. I have another one that I have a client that I support who it's not only texture, but it's the visual, the look of it. So if it looks a certain way, they won't even get near it. If it's a certain color, they won't get near it. I have a client who lacy curtains and eyeballs, like eyeballs on anything, eyeballs on like stuffed animals, googly eyeball. I mean, they freak her out, like, and then curtains, she says her skin gets
lacy curtains, you said.
Lacy, like those lacy curtains that old style.
This is great. You said you were going to say it kind of makes her skin crawl.
It makes her skin. She has a tactile reaction on her skin. So when she sees that.
Yeah. So one thing I didn't mention is something called synesthesia, which is the crossing over of two senses, whether or not that's what you're describing there. But sort of classically, this would be like someone who can taste colors or see sound. It sounds really weird. I have this in terms of when I'm listening to music, and if I key into it, I can sort of see this movement stuff, which is kind of cool. But people can actually have it be really, really strong reaction, like this reaction to these lacy curtains. We also know that synesthesia is a pretty rare thing, but it occurs about 50% more, in the neurodiverse population than it does in the neurotypical population. And again, sort of has to do with this overwiring. Right? So senses that aren't supposed to be yoked to each other end up being yoked to each other, and they're connected in some way, right?
Yeah.
There's a wonderful book called the The Particular Sadness of Lemon Cake. And I can't remember the author's name. And before I knew I was autistic, I was so enthralled with this book because it's all these creative descriptions of synesthesia, which is, representational. But yeah, that's a great example of that sort of aversion where she can look at a particular thing like these old curtains. What's interesting too is like therapists that aren't aware of these connections in autism might say, well, there must be trauma. There must be something about those drapes and there may be, but it could also just be, that's what I meant by that idiopathic, like specific person thing, like the googly eyes or that lace curtain thing. It sort of zip wires into the brain and kind of blows it up so that you can't pay attention to anything else when that's happening. Right?
That's another piece so let's talk about that, Dana, because if you're flooded and overwhelmed by your senses, right? And it's causing distress.
Yeah.
Right? We know theoretically that would impact attention, my ability to attend to the environment. So let's say this is happening in a classroom setting, for example.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And teachers, maybe I'll date us here, Dana, but teachers writing on a chalkboard with chalk.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah, that sound. Yeah.
I mean, I think about that. I can't even imagine, but
it's one of my favorite sounds. It's so funny. But yeah.
Really? But maybe that's overwhelming. And now we've got someone who's in distress. Would we say, look, they're not a good student.
Yeah. Yeah.
They won't pay attention. They're not motivated to learn.
Yeah.
Right.
And if it's a really young child, they might not even know that that's what's making their attention get hijacked. They may not even be able to say, oh yeah, writing on chalkboard is a trigger for me. So then you get, like you said, that people looking from the outside and like, oh, that kid doesn't pay attention, or what are the parents doing, or whatever it is.
Yeah. Right? The classroom management's poor. The teacher can't teach. I mean, like, there's all these pieces. And I feel like the sensory systems, the sensitivities, is actually something that is rarely thought about or discussed.
Really?
Wow. I see that a lot in classrooms. I see that a lot even in the work that our colleagues do. Wow. When we think about supporting individuals that have sensory sensitivities. And I will say it is just clinically, I'm in agreement that all of my clients who are neurodivergent, or all my clients who have an autistic an autism diagnosis, they all have sensory sensitivities. Yeah. There's something there, and that oftentimes leads to just like their endurance for being out in the world, their endurance for social interactions, their endurance for learning new things, or maybe like right now I'm seeing this because it's getting hotter, but heat sensitivities.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Temperature sensitivities.
Yeah.
Dana, as someone's listening to this, like our audience is listening to this, and I think our goal of this podcast is really to create this space to learn, to be curious, and have it impact the way in which we might not only think about ourselves, but we might think about others.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much societal pressure, right? For those seeing this video, and I'll describe this for our podcast listeners, I have a lot of clothing aversions. So even how something will sit on my body, like if it feels uneven, or there's like a sleeve that pulls funny, or the fabric itself is annoying, that be all I think about. Right. And so as a younger person, there's a lot of peer pressure to be a certain way, wear certain things. So I can remember sort of suffering through wearing a lot of those kinds of things. Whereas today, I would never do that to myself. But I'll even share this with my students. I think I counted them the other day. I have 21 of these iron-free cotton blend button-up collar shirts from LL Bean. I'm not trying to put an ad in here. And LL Bean.
But if you're listening, send Dana some free shirts.
And LL Bean cardigans and sweaters, right?
Yeah.
In a bunch of different colors. And I'll tell my students this. I'll be like, actually, you think I'm wearing the same outfit every day, and I actually have 8 of the white ones and 3 of the blue ones. And so I'm actually swapping it out, but I actually like to share that with folks, because there would be a time in my life where the peer pressure or the worry about what other people would think would be so strong that I wouldn't do that, right? Be like, oh my God, people are going to think I'm a slob and I wear the same thing all the time. And really what it is to have an outfit that feels predictable, and I don't have to worry about how it's going to feel on my body. And there'll even be some days like if I have something new. Like this morning when I was picking up my outfit, I'm like, oh, I have that new sweater I haven't worn yet. Maybe I should do that. I'm like, well, today needing attention, probably not the day to do that, right?
Yep.
So parlay that into like a child who doesn't even know what those sensitivities are yet, that we're forming basic relationships and what people are thinking. And then people that don't understand are going to make those snap judgments, right? Oh, what's wrong with that person, or what's that person doing? Or that kid isn't sitting still in their chair or not paying attention, or they have to tap their pencil a bunch and it's driving everybody else crazy, or whatever else it is, versus that checking in and saying, what's going on with you and what do you need? You work a lot with younger folks, and I think the barrier to figuring that out is harder because they're not necessarily aware of everything that triggers them. They don't have the language for it. And then to do it even in real time, when you're stressed out and overwhelmed, our language capacity just takes a dive. And so actually to put things in words and explain to the other person doesn't go well.
Yeah.
It's hard enough for adults to even sort of figured out some coping strategies for that. But yeah, living in that environment, that neurotypical environment that doesn't pay attention to those things at all, it's this huge stress, especially on kids who have to be in environments. And you mentioned something about endurance. I love that word. There's a scientific phrase for it called allostatic load, which is sort of like, how much are you carrying? How much have you already been exposed to in any given day? And I'll use the bucket analogy. So we all have like these 5-gallon Home Depot buckets. And if you haven't slept well, now there's some water in your bucket. And if you forgot to have breakfast, now there's water in your bucket. And so the pandemic, it's taken up a ton of room in everybody's bucket, neurotypical or not, right?
Yep.
And so how full is your bucket on any given day? And then does it take just that one more thing to have it splash all over? And that is that kid sitting in a classroom who can't sit still because all they're thinking about is, how their shoes feel.
Yeah.
Or someone forced them to wear socks and they can't stand the feeling of socks.
Yeah. Yeah. Or heaven forbid there's a assembly that day, or an earthquake drill for those of us living in California, or lockdown drills now today. These are kind of new stressors.
Yeah.
Going back to that bucket, that idea of like, we have a limited amount of resources.
Yeah.
All of us do. And, what you have in the bank, what you have in that bucket, what the spend is, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think the other piece that I really needed to wrap my head around as a neurotypical person was that some of the things that I take for granted, my clients spend a lot of energy on.
Yeah.
So for example, like, I know I need to brush my teeth. I really, really dislike the way that feels in my mouth, but I know I have to do it.
Yeah.
Like that might only cost me, a couple drops of water or nothing at all, because it's like I don't register it. But that might cost, a few cups of water for a client in that bucket.
Absolutely.
So there's that piece too, and really trying to understand what is the spend, like what is the cost of all these things that, add up. If it's only one drop that leads to the splash, right?
Yeah,
I think this is the other thing that when I hear it as when I'm supporting, a parent or a system, they'll say to me, Gwen, it's like the reaction's so disproportionate from the event. And it's like, all we did is offered them, a blue pencil over red. And then they exploded. And I'm like, that's because
that last thing.
Like it's cumulative. There was a cumulative buildup. That just happened to be the last drop.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that you do see that kind of meltdown phase more in kids because they don't know their patterns as well. And again, they don't know
Yeah.
how to voice it. They're still figuring it out. Not that this doesn't happen in adults, because it certainly does.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely. And I like to use the bucket analogy because we can talk about things being added and stress being added, but we can also borrow from the chronic pain world about, people hear this a lot now, about how many spoons do you have, right? Yeah. And so that is that. I start the day with 5 spoons, and if I give them away for things like that, now I'm at the end of the day, I have no spoons, or I've gone into the negative spoonage, right? And then I'm going to have to, I'll do this socially. If I'm going to have something that is out in the world a lot, I plan days after that for decompression time, or I'll space those things out. Like, I know if I have to do something, big social connections or something that's going to be triggers, like the Pride Parade, I love going, but oh my God, then I may not, someone says, oh, you want to go see this new movie with me, like the day after. I'd say, well, actually, can we push it to the following week? So that idea of keeping that bucket manageable, or not giving away all your spoons, but absolutely, it's cumulative. And that's when it doesn't seem to make sense. You can have a kid who touches something that isn't one of their sensory sensitivities, but they've had all these other ones pile on, and all of a sudden someone touches them on the shoulder and they just blow up, right? Because it reminds me of, for those Monty Python watchers out there, there's one where the guy's eating a ton and he says, have one wafer thin mint. It's that last little thing, and then the guy's body just explodes. It's such a good example of that. And I think that, I haven't watched it yet, but the new Disney movie, Turning Red, I think a lot of people in the autism community are saying that's a good example of like, oh, I can't handle all this, and I just sort of turn into this other thing.
Yeah. Dina, as we're talking about, there's kind of like this internal external thing that where my mind goes, which is, we understand how someone is internally, privately, if you will, in many ways, in the world. Yeah. What is the comfort? What are the edges of comfort? What does stress look like on this system? Right. The other, I think, externally, because of course everyone lives in a context, everyone lives in an environment, in a context. Right. So, how do we also, it's like we need to empower the person themselves as they get more knowledge of themselves to do what you're doing, right? To be like, wow, I know this is going to be really taxing on me. I really want to show up to this thing in the best way possible. So can we delay that by a week, right? Yeah. I know my neurological reset time is going to be 2 days on that, or whatever
it
that
takes a while to learn those things.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
So there's that piece. That is so important. And that brings me to this feeling, or that one of the senses you were talking about, which is interoception. And I feel like interoception, having a sense of the state of your body, if we want to say it in that way, is highly and heavily connected to self-awareness. Yeah. And if we don't help people develop their own self-knowledge, adding symbols to that, maybe words, pictures, how then can we help them manage themselves exactly like you are, right? Like, I mean, a good example of that, Dana, is, Dana and I were going to tape on July the 5th. Yeah. And, so beautifully, you're like, oh my gosh, I live in this place where people really love July 4th, and there's going to be fireworks going off all night. I'm not going to get great sleep. And I'm just not going to show up to tape an episode in a way that I'm going to feel good about.
Exactly.
Right?
Great example.
Right. Or like, you're like, I don't want to wear a new cardigan today. I want to be sharp. That's going to take too much. That might add water in my bucket that I don't actually want.
Right. Right. And that, you bring up an important point too. So when you learn these things too, I mean, a lot of those kinds of things I can be in the groove and I don't have to spend a lot of energy even thinking about. Yeah. But for younger folks, or folks that haven't gotten in that groove, or if it's something that you don't have a groove for, then it sort of builds up and heightens, and you can't attend to other things. And I would say that's the majority of the work that I do with adult autistics in my practice, is learning those things about yourself and managing them. Right. I had a guy I saw for years, really early appointment. We met at like 6:30 in the morning. And not surprisingly, he would not eat before he came. He'd forget. And he was also a Diet Coke lover. And so the first thing I do when he came, and I have my office in my house, first thing I do when he come in my house is I'd hand him a Diet Coke and a protein bar, and we'd have breakfast together, right? And we talked a lot about that. He's like, I've never had any therapists do this with me before, but we talked about it in the context of paying attention to cues and those kinds of things, because he had a tendency to work all day and forget to eat or use the bathroom or anything along those lines. So really, it is about teaching self-awareness. And last episode, and I think you and I practice similarly, is to not have judgment about it, right? It just is. These are these things that are unique to you. I'm so blessed to have a partner that can normalize that and just say, hey, whatever works for you, that's great, right? Who cares what other people think? Have, 6 blue cardigans, who cares, right? Does it work? Why are you worried about it? Easy for me to say as a fully formed, autonomous adult, but for kids, there's so much judgment, right? Kids judge each other. They snicker behind each other. There's bullying that takes place. And then there's this paradigm idea of the dominant culture and then the minority culture. This series that was on about an autistic kid called Atypical. A lot of people have a lot of opinions about that show, but there was one, I think it was the second or third season, where the main character's girlfriend wants to have the school dance in a way that her autistic boyfriend can attend. And, the loud music and was the main trigger for him. So she really presses the teachers and parents to have it be where everybody else wears headphones to listen to music. And the character gets to come in and have the place not loud. Now, even, as a member of the sort of the dominant, we've all grown up in that dominant culture, that ableistic culture. I was like, well, that's sort of silly, because you're gonna make all these other people do it, and he could just wear the noise canceling headphones. But the scene was so beautiful, and I sort of get choked up, because you go in there and all the other kids are like, that's cool, I'll wear my headphones. And to just see that zeitgeist shift from the majority just saying, I'm not going to pay attention to that, to almost like that upside down world from Stranger Things, right? Where it's the kid who's autistic, it's quiet. Why not? Why don't everybody wear headphones and not have the loudness everywhere?
Yeah.
And it's those kinds of perspective changes that are so important, I think, to teach autistics themselves, so they feel like they can take up space in the world. Parents, teachers, folks like that, those are those aha moments that I get so psyched about as a psychologist, because it's like, ooh, that little flip, and now I can see something I didn't see before. Right?
Yeah, it's really powerful, because it has this kind of ripple effect, I think, in the way that we think about things, even like, I love this idea even of taking it one step further, of sensory simulations. And I don't know if you've ever done these types of things. I've done this with
Say more.
Neurotypical teachers, employers, where it's like, all right, let's just add a level of pressure to reading something that you can barely decode.
Nice.
Right.
Nice.
It's just adding those levels. There's some really nice like YouTube videos on sensory simulations about the way someone might experience. It's all sounds at the same, volume at once, these types of things. It just gives another, I think, the heart of our intention for this podcast was really to drive curiosity and empathy for a neurotypical perspective, but and a neurodivergent perspective, but for both, because we are these are the dominant culture, the neuromajority, kind of go on and we live life in this very I think sometimes easy way in regards to like, oh, I get what's normal. It's not hard for me. I don't have to spend extra energy there.
Right.
We just kind of lose sight of, I think, that there are different ways to be in the world. We just have to pay attention. I think that's another piece for us. Dana, you and I were like, how do we drive attention, even if it's for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, whatever that is. How do we empower people with information to maybe change a mindset, to shift it, to make a pivot?
Yeah, and that empathy piece is so important because as you were talking, I was envisioning like I live in Seattle, and so going down to Pike Place Market's fun once in a while. Unless we'll think about doing it, we're like, will there be a ton of people there? And if it's going to be a day where it's going to be packed, yeah, maybe not. But I was thinking of like a little kid going into that scenario. You can handle more when you have the people you're with are taking an empathetic stance, right?
Yeah.
Being seen. So if a parent's like, I know this is going to be overloading for you, do you want to go? Then now you're not alone in it. And it actually gives some resilience and gives some tempering to be able to handle that, right?
Yeah.
We were at that ball game and I mentioned the smell stuff to my wife, and she even said, are you going to be okay? Do you need to leave? And I said, no, just telling you was enough so that that's sort of going on. And that it really illustrates the power of being seen and getting that validation. And I think that's why that scene in Atypical hit me the way it did, because it's a whole group of even students and peers saying, yeah, let's flip this and try it the other way, right?
Yeah.
I can remember in junior high, they blindfolded us one day and we walked all around the place to see what it was like to be blind. And at the time I thought, oh yeah, I can do that. But I have sight privilege because I didn't grow up blind and I don't have to live that way every day. But the whole idea is get a glimpse into it so you can have a sense of what that might be like, right?
Yeah.
And then so you can be someone, I've been out and about before where I can clearly see it's somebody who's probably on the spectrum, having some issues, and even just be sort of moving over them and saying, do you need anything? Is there anything I can help? And that alone, even from a stranger, I think can go a long way for folks. Having those allies, having people that just sort of get it and you can see them seeing you. And that's just the basic human need, right? For everybody.
I was just going to say that, like that's something that humans respond to, right?
Yeah,
To be seen, understood at this very, I think, core, vulnerable kind of place. And that, you and I haven't necessarily spoken about this, but, a lot of times when we speak about sensory sensitivities and we're supporting our clients, co-regulation tends to be a term or a phrase that comes up, meaning, if someone's having a difficult time regulating their senses, right, in a moment, can another person help to co-regulate them?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think this is the power of relationship.
Absolutely.
Relationships are powerful when you are seen in the context of that relationship and someone meets you where you are.
Yeah. I think that's why, especially women and girls gravitate towards animals to such a great degree, because there is that sense of, it can actually be sort of irritating at times when your dog's just staring at you constantly, but right. Oh, I want something. But there also is this kind of unconditional co-regulator, and service animals that we train, especially to work with autistic kids, can do deep pressure, can stop a kid from doing a harmful stim, those kinds of things, or redirect it. And for people in the environment to know that if someone is totally to overload or meltdown and they're doing something like hitting themselves or a visible stim that makes someone else comfortable, instead of saying, oh my God, what's wrong with you? Say, oh, what do you need? We need to get you out of here right now. And now is not the time to be, having a conversation about, you should be okay. What are you doing? Stop doing that. It's like, no, you need an exit strategy right now. And that's one of my passions. And the reason I started the Awake Project was to not just to get information out there for autistics, but for people that are in their lives or just people that want to know more about it. So there is that. With understanding comes empathy, right?
Yeah.
When we talk about any kind of in and out group, political affiliations, and all those kinds of things, it really is about, it's an us and them because there's a fear about an unknown, right? Or there's an assumption about an unknown. And as soon as you shed light on that and you say, oh, that's what's going on. Okay, now I get it. Right?
Yeah.
Or I'm starting to understand that. And now you've got a connection there, like you said, that relationship, and people, you automatically feel held more, even if people aren't actually saying that.
Yeah, and to create spaces where you can have differing opinions
Yeah.
about something without and still feeling heard and seen. You
Yeah.
know, that being heard and seen doesn't mean that someone needs to be in agreement.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, and I think that gets lost, especially I think
You can have
politically.
both at the same time. I
Yeah,
can be frustrated with you and also still love you.
yeah.
And yeah, it's so easy to lose sight of that for sure. And then just get anxious about it and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Dana, when you were talking about the meltdown, maybe what's also helpful for I find is the difference between a meltdown and a tantrum.
Oh God. Yeah. The big T tantrum word.
The big T. And that oftentimes meltdowns are misperceived as tantrums.
Yeah.
And that we see tantrums usually as something that's more volitional or something that's more in
Yeah.
someone's control, versus a meltdown is an overloaded system, like a danger, Will Robinson danger kind of situation where that person is not in control of their system, their body. And so the way that we might address or support would be different for a meltdown than it would be in a tantrum. But that doesn't always happen, I think. I think those two things don't those tantrums and meltdowns don't typically get delineated.
Yeah, because I could let's just go with a real tantrum for what that means, right? I was trained as an Adlerian psychologist, so we would even look at, okay, if a kid's having a tantrum, what are they trying to convey? What is the purpose of their behavior?
Yeah.
And whether it's I want attention, or I want to be left alone, or I'm not getting my way and it's a control thing, you know, I'm trying to vie for control and all those other things, we still want to be aware of, well, why is that kid having a tantrum if it's like the good old fashioned tantrum?
Yeah.
If it's a meltdown, that's that sensory overload. And there's a sense of, I have no other way to deal with this than to, you know, fall down or start hitting things or start biting, you know, or screaming or whatever it is. That sense of what my wife and I will refer to as, I feel like I want to tear my face off, right? Or my skin off. And for an adult, I can say, oh my God, I have this feeling like I just want to, don't look at me, I'm hideous, or I want to tear my face off. For a little kid, they can feel that building and they don't know to circumvent it. You have to learn to do that. But yeah, to have parents, caregivers, teachers understand, why is this kid doing this, right? And if it's an autistic kid, it's almost always going to be sensory overwhelm. And then you're going to treat those differently, right?
Yeah.
So a good old fashioned tantrum, depending on the situation, it might be indicated to like ignore the child, give them space. With meltdown, it might mean they really need your help getting out of whatever is triggering them. So if they're down at Pike Place Market, we need to leave, or something along those lines. And so the response is really different.
Yeah.
And a partner for adults where they say, I'm starting to panic. Okay, we need to get out of here right now, right? It isn't about, oh, you'll be fine, don't worry about it, look around, you know, that sort of patronizing way of trying to get someone, or my personal favorite, oh, just calm down. That's like the
it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal, Dana.
Yeah, it's not a big deal for you. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you can, you know, also talk about sensory issues that can actually take you beyond a meltdown to shutdown.
Yep.
Where you actually, everything sort of blanks out and you're in this weird fugue place. To me, think about what's going on neurologically, right? Your brain is just saying, I can't do it, I'm shutting down. It's adaptive, right?
Yeah.
So I've heard family members say things like, well, we had planned to do this day and you're being rigid and stubborn and you don't want to do this. And actually in that state, you really do need to just give them space and, or provide nurturing, or just ask them what they need, or, you know, shut all the blinds in the house or whatever to bring as much water out of that bucket again as you can.
Yeah. And they need help because in those moments, the brain, the higher parts of the brain that can the parts of the brain that, you know, like problem solve, analyze, use language, those are not accessible at that time.
Right.
Those
That's
are
right.
completely, they're shut off.
Yeah.
One of my clients has called it a whiteout,
Yeah, it's a good way to
where
put
they
it.
just see static.
Yeah.
It's just snow.
Yeah.
And they know. And I think, sometimes our colleagues, Dana, will call that dissociative.
Yeah, and there's a difference because I can talk about that as a professional and as someone who has experienced both,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Dissociation is more of like a I'm not here. It's like a I'm out of my body. The numb feeling is similar between both. But when you're in shutdown, it's this weird sort of feeling. It's like you're not numb. You're aware of what's going on in your surroundings, but everything sort of feels like you're under jello, like everything's just a little slower. I always tell folks I have this weird feeling like my lips are swollen, but they're not. It's a sort of weird feeling in your face, like the world, you just feel like there's a buffer between you and the physical world, but you're aware of it being there. In dissociation, you're not.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the what the brain's doing might be similar in terms of I need to protect you from this thing, but the experience of them are very different. Right?
Yeah.
And people can have both.
Yeah, absolutely. And,
Mhm.
and this could be another episode, but I mean, even just talking about, the differences with like schizophrenia,
Oh, yeah.
psychosis, I mean,
Yeah.
and that's something that I'm seeing more and more as I support adults who are autistic and have mental health concerns.
Yeah.
How do you start to parse those apart, and how do we support someone in this very nuanced kind of way? I mean, I think what we're really highlighting is nuance. And in our first episode about labelism, because we made a now we're just going to call it labelism, Dana. We're talking about the nuances of labels and how important it is to use labels, be mindful of the way that labels are used. I mean, that sometimes they're not necessary, and sometimes they block, and sometimes they facilitate things that are necessary for that person to get the supports that they need, or to be in the world in a way that's more comfortable, right?
Yeah, right.
This is very similar. I think about how important comfort is when I think about sensory preferences, sensory profiles, sensory sensitivities. We have to know the edges of comfort, and that when we move outside the edges of comfort, why?
Yeah.
Is it worth it?
Right.
Yeah.
I think about like I teach adult learners. I teach in a graduate program, and things like if I have autistic students, will ask if we can turn the lights down or off because we have those horrible fluorescent overhead lights, right?
Yeah.
And the answer is sort of it depends. Like if there's no light in the room, that's a problem. But if we have a window, we can certainly do that. Or really work with them and say, do you have sunglasses with you? And they say, oh, are you going to be okay with me if I wear sunglasses to class? And I said, well, I would know why. So having this conversation, well, I'm going to be really worried about what other people think. And so I might say, if you're willing and if you're comfortable and you don't have to do this at all, if you want to let people know that's why you're wearing sunglasses. And again, in a room full of burgeoning psychologists, usually everybody is like, oh, thanks for telling us. That's so cool that you have a way to deal with that. Thanks for educating me. Little kids might be a little more judgmental or not necessarily understand that. But then really little kids, usually you flip back to that of, I wasn't even thinking about why you were in sunglasses. It's okay with me. I don't care, but there's so much trauma that happens with folks around judgment and not being seen that the propensity is to pull inward and not share anything because it's too vulnerable. People have hurt me too much. I've not gotten my needs met.
Yeah.
And so if you can do that slowly and get your need met, it's like, oh, maybe I can do this. Right.
Yeah.
It's the road to being empowered or self-advocacy is a very long one, and it's many, many steps, as and back and forth and back and forth. Yeah, for sure.
I love that. That's self-advocacy is not just your ability to say what you need, right?
Yeah.
Your self-knowledge has to be quite robust, and you have to have a lexicon or symbols to represent how you can communicate that self-knowledge or how you
Exactly.
understand it for yourself before you even use it.
Yeah.
And how many times not only maybe the environment, so maybe a family system or a school system, but maybe there's someone in an intervention where it's like, it's either this way or no way. Like you either behave this way because
Yeah.
that's compliant. And so I think a lot of times with the adults, some of the adults that I support who have received pretty traditional ABA services,
Oh, right. Yeah.
they've been totally cut off to their
Yeah.
own body signals
Yeah,
because
they've been trained to not pay
Yeah.
attention to them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we've got a lot of work to do, and that it's a very formalized process to build self-knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah.
What I love about your example, Dana, with your student is that there's a collaboration.
Yeah.
It started with a disclosure, and then there was a space that was created for understanding, and then there was a collaboration for a solution.
Yeah.
And that's the piece that I wish we could do more often.
Yeah. Rather than just saying, well, you're just going to have to deal with it because you can't turn the lights down. Like I can imagine happening. Yeah.
Right. And the other side of the equation that I've seen, which is, well, that's not fair for everyone else.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, my personal favorite. Yeah.
Yeah, your personal.
Let's ask everybody else and see if they're okay with it.
Yeah. So I think, like as we close up this episode, it's really encouraging people to understand that that senses are the first way we encode the world.
Yeah.
For us neurotypicals, we don't usually think about it that way.
Right.
We don't usually think about being in the world in a sensory way, actually, unless we're very consciously minded, or like for me, I'm pretty sound sensitive, so I just know there are some things, or I'm visually sensitive as well, and so if I see a cupboard open, like it's my big trigger to close it. But, so that there are senses are important. They're the first way we encode the world, and that they're more than just what we've been taught. It's not just seeing, hearing, tasting, and touch, right? We've got proprioception, interoception, and how we feel in the world. Right.
Yep.
And that for autistics, this is like drinking sometimes through a fire hose.
Yeah, it's a daily thing.
Daily struggle. And that seeking to understand first before we solve people's problems or make judgments. Really, we want to encourage people to maybe just take a moment.
Take a moment. Try to understand.
And this for everybody, actually. Help me understand why. I don't understand why.
Yeah, that's that. If I had one word that people can do is just ask why, right?
Ask why.
Because that imparts curiosity, and I want to know, instead of just saying, oh, labeling it like, oh, it's a tantrum.
Yeah.
Why is that happening?
Yeah.
What might be contributing to that? And
how do we understand it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Love it.
Which is what we do as psychologists. We just act like 2-year-olds perpetually and say, why?
Yeah, like 7 times. Like we really haven't gotten to the bottom of it unless we've hit the 7th why,
there
right?
You go.
Like
Exactly.
That's until, our clients are like, their eyes have rolled to the back of their head. They're like, oh my God. Anyway, driving insight. Practicing communication, practicing, saying what it is, putting words to our experiences,
That's right. Yeah.
It's the fun part of being a psychologist. Dana, episode number 2. Number 2. Yep. And if for all of our audience that are listening, the all 2 of you now, because, I'm thinking we've got one more person in our audience in the first episode. So now we've got maybe 2 people in the audience.
There you go.
If there's something that you'd like Dana and I to have a conversation about, put it in the comments below.
Or ask us why.
And we want to create that really nice, open, curious space. Anyway, thanks everyone for listening and watching. See you in the next episode.
Bye-bye.